The stories. Night Guard, who followed footprints beyond the bridge. The first prints showed on a cold night when the river smoked and the closed bridge let out a slow iron groan. Frost held the gravel in a crust, so every step someone took across the municipal yard snapped like thin glass. Merrick Holland worked nights because he liked quiet places and because the warehouse paid overtime when storms rolled in. He was 41 by the last week of January, and he kept his thermos on the dash while he did his rounds. His plan was simple that night. Check the north fence. Check the generator shed. Sign the log before dawn and head home on the empty road. He saw the prints on his second pass, and their path made little sense when he stood still to study them. The footprints curved toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed the narrow river, which had been closed since late autumn while crews waited on parts. A chain-link panel barred the entrance with a sign that warned about unsafe decking, and Marek knew the sign by heart. He radioed the dispatcher with a routine note, since procedure made repeaters of careful guards. He kept his words easy. He said there were footprints where there should be none, and that he would check closer. The reply was scratchy and bored, and Marek almost laughed at the familiar tone. The treads were small and tidy, like work boots with a diamond pattern, and each step pressed the frost to a dark oval. The prints went right up to the chain-link panel, then slipped under at a low spot where someone had pulled wire loose. Marek knelt and touched the ground, and cold shot through his glove while he reset the bent ties. He peered down the dark shape of the bridge and decided he would not walk out there in the cold wind, not without telling someone first. He called again, then kept his flashlight tight to the decking while he stepped forward, and he felt the bridge vibrate under his boots. He moved slow because he always moved slow when he could choose between slow and fast. Halfway across, the prints turned to powder as the frost thinned, and he had to scan both sides for scuffs on the gray boards. He found a faint line where grit had dragged, like something heavy had been pulled by rope. On the far side, the deck ended at a set of concrete steps that dropped to the river path, and here the prints deepened again. They pointed left, past an old pipe cradle and a low stand of scrub willow. Reports in the fall had mentioned fissures along the bank after hours, which was normal, and a few had been moved along without trouble. A clerk at the gas station had told an officer that a man bought batteries and duct tape in the same visit, which was normal enough, though people sometimes remember strange details when asked at night. Dispatch logs showed power dips near the intake station from time to time, and maintenance had chalked that up to loose connections in cold weather. Marek followed the prints along the river path until they vanished near a patch of bare gravel that the sun struck most days, even in winter. He stood there and listened. Somewhere upstream, an owl made 3 soft calls, and a semi rolled past on the highway with a roar that shook the willow branches. He decided he had gone far enough for one night. He photographed the prints on his phone and headed back, and he wrote a careful note in the log before dawn. By the next shift, the frost lifted late, and the yard lights burned a clean white circle on the gravel. Marek checked the generator shed first and noticed something he could not shake. The small lock on the diesel cap was scuffed, and a scratch ran from the cap to the lip like a hose had rubbed while someone steadied a weight. He checked the fuel slip from the last delivery and did the quick math. The level looked low by a few gallons, which could happen, and which also could not. He spoke with Celia Karp in maintenance the following afternoon because Celia knew more about the place than anyone in the office. Celia was 58 and had worked 3 floods and 2 droughts, and she kept a pocket notebook with every code for every panel. She said the power dips had been shrugged off by city, and that nobody had time to pull the panels until spring. She said the bridge closure made her nervous because blocked paths invite shortcuts. On the third night, Marek went to the bridge before his first pass, and he crouched at the chain-link panel with a small bag of sidewalk chalk from the supply closet. He rubbed a pinch of red chalk into the dirt under the gap and dusted the decking where the prints had scuffed before. He wanted a way to tell if someone crossed again, and he wanted to see where the dust went when the night did its work. He made his rounds slower than usual and kept his eyes on corners where things hide without trying. The radio remained quiet until midnight. Then a call came in about a coyote by the south gate. Marek drove down and found only wind, and he thought the call felt like a joke he had heard before. He logged it anyway. because logs are the bones of quiet jobs. When he returned to the bridge, his light caught the faintest red sunset on the boards, and he felt alert in the way he liked. The chalk had smeared in a thin line toward the far steps, and the dust trailed down to the river path. On the gravel, small red flecks marked an arc that led behind a stack of old culvert pipe where few people bothered to look. He moved closer and found a cooler wedged inside a culvert mouth, and an inverter buzzed inside like a tired hornet. A length of clear hose lay coiled by the cooler, and the nozzle had a strip of duct tape where a leak had been patched. The setup looked temporary and careful, like someone trusted routine more than luck. Marek called dispatch, and his voice stayed even while he chose words that would not set hairs on necks. An officer drove down the service road and met him by the culvert, and they stood and listened together. The officer did not rush, which Marek respected, and the two men watched the bridge until the wind shifted. The officer said he would put a note on the morning brief, and he asked Marek to keep eyes open without playing hero. The phrase made Marek smile, and later he did not tell that part to anyone. In the days after, Marek traced the quiet pattern that repeats when someone abuses access. He checked camera angles and discovered the North Yard camera had been bumped on a date that matched a power dip, and the new angle showed the sky more than the gate. He opened the back of the housing and found 3 screws missing, which was always a tell. He measured the footprints with a scrap of tape and got the same length each time, which told him the walker was careful with steps or else was one person always. He walked to the diner 2 blocks away during the afternoon and chatted with the cook named Huxley, who knew every vehicle that rolled through after midnight. Huxley said a man in a dark jacket sat late 2 nights a week, always with a single cup of coffee and a pocket radio on the booth seat. Huxley said the man tipped exact change and left when the freight trains crossed the river, which happened near the time Marion Street patrol cars swapped shifts. At the yard, a temporary guard from an agency had been filling 2 nights that Mark traded away for overtime on weekends. The temp signed the log with 2 letters and a quick crooked line. The initials were H and P, which matched about 1,000 people and which could match none. Marek did not care for suspicion as a hobby, yet he did not care for coincidences when fuel levels fell in quiet inches. He sat in his sedan before shift and went through old notes in his glove box where he kept manuals and photocopies. A contractor named Deacon Varelli had lost access in 2017 after a billing fight, and his crew had worked the intake station on that very river path for years. Marek wrote the name on a small card, then tossed the card at once, because names can lead you down the wrong hall. He kept his attention on the temp schedule instead, and he compared logs against the chalk nights and the reported coyote calls. On a dry Tuesday, red chalk showed again on the gravel, and the cooler in the culvert had moved 2 feet, which looked like a nervous person trying to outsmart the obvious. Marek called the non-emergency number and asked for a quiet presence, and officers waited with their lights low behind the old salt shed. Marek did his rounds with wide loops and checked his watch without seeming to check, and he waited on the near side of the bridge by the chain link panel. A figure came over the crest like a shadow that had business, and the boots set down in precise little ovals. The man wore a dark jacket with reflective piping like the agency issued, and he carried a duffel that sagged from weight. Marek stepped forward and kept his light on the ground, and he spoke steady without trying to sound like an actor. He said the bridge was closed by order of city, and he asked if help was needed. The man froze and looked left toward the culvert, which told Marek the only thing he really needed to know. The officers stepped from behind the shed, and everything stayed dull and true from there. The duffel held a 12-volt pump, a power bank, and 2 hoses cut to different lengths. The cooler held the inverter and spare tape and a stack of empty hand warmers, which can keep batteries alive just long enough between dips. The generator diesel cap carried the same tape residue as the hose, which tied the loop neatly enough for any careful mind. In the report that later circulated, details sat plain without flourish, which is how such documents talk to the world. The temp guard was named Harley Pruitt, age 36, and he had worked a roster of small night jobs that rewarded boredom more than skill. Archived calls showed he had reported animal movement at the south gate on the nights when the pump likely ran, which kept eyes away from the river path. Store security footage from across the highway reportedly showed a man matching his build, buying duct tape and batteries on a schedule that matched power dips at the intake station. Celia came down with a wrench the following morning and replaced the generator cap, and she tightened every panel on every camera while humming through her teeth. She shook Merrick's hand with hard gratitude, and she told him the thing she always tells the new ones. Quiet places are never empty, and attention is the difference between a close call and a cleanup. People in town talked for a day, and then they talked about weather and games and a boat stuck on the ramp. Merrick logged his shift and ran a cloth across the dusty dash, and he looked once at the bridge where the chain link panel still hung crooked. He felt a small weight lift, which felt almost like pride, and then he felt something more like relief. He went back to the prints in his head, and he ran the path out again from the first night to the last. The steps had led beyond the bridge in the way tracks tell their whole story, and the red chalk had given him a quiet map. He thought about the way a small problem can hide inside a larger closure, and how a closed bridge invites someone to think rules are only suggestion. He drove the empty road home before dawn, and the river threw thin fog across the low bend like quiet breath. Merrick did not decide to keep working nights forever, and he did not make any grand vow. He thought instead about the small habits that keep a place honest, and the way a single set of prints can reveal a patient plan. In a town that prefers routine, a careful person with time can pull things apart slowly, unless another careful person keeps watch and asks simple questions that carry weight. By spring, the bridge opened again with new planks that smelled like fresh-cut pine, and families leaned on the rail to watch geese slide by. Some people remember a rumor when they cross, while most only hear water and light traffic and the chatter of kids. Merrick crosses when his route calls for it, and he never looks for drama, though he notices scuffs out of habit and checks if gates sit straight. He keeps chalk in the glove box still, and he keeps a small card that reminds him that attention wins more often than luck. The card does not carry a name, and it does not need one, because the lesson was simple and dull and true. He followed footprints beyond a bridge that everyone ignored, and he found a tidy machine made for taking small pieces of a place that trusted silence. Quiet work gave him back a little faith, which is worth more on a night shift than any badge or speech. When people ask him why he noticed, Marek says it was the shape of the morning frost and the numbers that never add fair. He tells them he just kept walking where the prince asked him to go, and he wrote things down when they mattered. He says a bridge is still a path even when closed, and that someone will use that fact to their advantage at least once. The rest of the time, he does not say much, and he lets the town hold its small stories without fuss, because most of them end with someone paying attention and returning what does not belong to them. The ferry passenger who never disembarked at Sitka. On a cool morning in Sitka, port workers watched a ferry ease through Sitka Sound while gulls traced slow circles overhead. The vessel's horn rolled over water that smelled of kelp and diesel and early rain. Among the manifested arrivals, one name would reportedly remain unanswered at the terminal doors. People wheeled bags across wet pavement while radio traffic clicked and paused around the ramp. The absence did not ring alarms first, it only lingered as a missing footstep in a practiced routine. The passenger, listed as Charles Weaver, was 62, a retired accountant from Spokane traveling to Sitka to visit his younger sister. He had boarded at Juneau 2 nights earlier, carrying one rolling suitcase and a canvas daypack. A purser noted his quiet demeanor and a habit of reading schedules taped beside stairwells. State records list his height, his gray hair, and an emergency contact with a Washington area code. His purpose in Sitka was simple. He planned to help arrange minor repairs at a family rental. The crew roster that week included a junior deckhand named Ian, 27, who worked nights cleaning rails and checking life rings. He remembered a man matching Weaver's description standing alone near the stern during the long run south. The wind carried spray and conversation toward the cafeteria, where lights stayed warm through the small hours. Some travelers slept against windows, while others played cards near vending machines that hummed against the bulkhead. Ian said he noticed the man review a folded map, then pocket it when the aisle cleared. Dispatch logs from the terminal record the arrival time at dawn, with light rain sweeping across Baranof Island. The ramp grounded against the apron, and trucks rolled off while several pedestrians gathered under a metal awning. A clerk scanned barcodes as passengers filed past a yellow line where a guard checked random bags. The logs show a brief power flicker in the terminal hall, then a reset that lasted under 1 minute. No incident codes were assigned, and operations resumed without delay or comment. Weaver's sister reached the terminal late after a stalled school zone detour near Sawmill Creek Road. She parked near the chain-link fence and watched the last pedestrians scatter toward taxis and waiting relatives. By her account, the rain slowed and a mist sat low across Crescent Harbor. She checked her phone and called twice. Without success, the calls rang without answer, and times were stamped in her provider records. She later told officers she felt uneasy without any specific reason beyond a silence that extended past habit. When baggage carts emptied, a single gray suitcase circled on the belt with no claimant stepping forward to lift it away. The tag matched Weaver's name and routing, printed in black on a laminated slip. A terminal agent moved the suitcase behind a counter and wrote a simple note on a clipboard. No alarm was triggered because unclaimed luggage appears with predictable frequency on rainy mornings. The agent set the suitcase on a shelf and returned to help a couple searching for a misplaced fishing rod. Archived notes taken that afternoon indicate officers spoke separately with two travelers who remembered a man fitting the description. One was an art teacher from Sitka who sketched whales from the solarium during the night hours. She recalled the man leaning on the rail near Mount Edgecombe's faint outline when clouds parted for a moment. Another was a mechanic from Ketchikan who said the same man bought coffee twice and asked about taxi prices in town. Investigators never confirmed the timing with receipts, and no surveillance covered the solarium benches. The county file from 2009 in a separate missing traveler case shows a similar pattern of unclaimed baggage and unclear disembarkation. That earlier file included a ferry manifest, a terminal sweep, and door checks against wind gusts that sometimes move latches. It also noted how passengers occasionally exit through service doors when following crew in reflective jackets. In that instance, the traveler was located later at a motel near a cannery road after walking away in heavy rain. Investigators compared the patterns, yet the Sitka details failed to line up cleanly. Ferry officers reviewed internal access logs for closed stairwells that connect vehicle decks and passenger spaces. They found no anomalies, only routine entries by maintenance staff checking bilge alarms and a cleaner replacing paper towels. A camera near the cafeteria recorded partial views of faces during meal hours but missed the corridor leading to the aft lounge. Reviewers watched the files twice and logged timestamps at 5-minute intervals to mark movement clusters. Some locals claimed an extra gap appeared near the end of the recording, yet technicians reported no dropped frames. At midweek, state records show officers walked the shoreline on both sides of the terminal looking for disturbed kelp lines. The tide had fallen quickly after the ferry's docking, leaving slick rocks and sand flecked with broken shells. They checked ladders, pilings, and fenders for fibers or scuffs that might indicate contact with clothing or bags. A harbor patrol boat swept the inner channel while rain stiffened from the south and visibility narrowed along the hills. Nothing turned up beyond a hat band caught on a cleat that belonged to someone else. Weaver's phone connected briefly to a tower outside town at a time that conflicted with the expected walk-off window. Analysts plotted pings against ferry timetables and decided the reading could reflect device drift under poor weather. A later attempt to triangulate from neighboring towers gave no additional certainty for the immediate period following docking. The device never registered a data session in Sitka proper, and voicemail remained unchanged for several days. The phone was eventually found powered down inside the gray suitcase held behind the terminal counter. When officers opened the suitcase with the sisters' consent, they found clothing folded tightly and a small bottle of vitamins. There was also a spiral notebook with mileage notes and simple arithmetic tracking gas costs for earlier segments of travel. A handwritten list named tasks in Sitka, including a visit to a plumbing supplier and a stop at a family storage unit. Nothing suggested immediate plans beyond errands that fit a short visit. The day pack remained missing, and no one recalled seeing it after the ship's cafeteria closed for the night. A taxi dispatcher reportedly checked logs and found no record of a pickup under Weaver's name during the docking hour. Drivers sometimes accept cash riders who wave at the curb, which complicates documentation on wet mornings when lines are short. One driver remembered a man stepping toward the curb, then turning away while fastening his jacket. The driver could not establish the face, and weather limited the view through the windshield that kept fogging despite the fan. The report noted the uncertainty without assigning weight, and the lead stayed open. Some locals claimed the man left the ship early through a service door when the deckhands repositioned chocks around wheel wells. Crew statements conflicted on door status because procedures allow short openings during shifts and quick closures afterward. A safety officer said those doors close against air pressure that resists casual pushes from the outside. He added that wind can trick hinges and create sounds that resemble latches when traffic moves on the ramp. Investigators never confirmed external access during that window, and the theory remained a line in the file. Searchers walked the footpath toward Totem Park, checking benches and thickets where travelers sometimes paused to adjust bags. Rain lifted briefly, and a weak sun set bands of silver across Sitka Sound, while ravens scolded from cedar branches. A groundskeeper reported no new camps or discarded bottles that would suggest a hasty stop. Officers spoke with staff at a nearby cafe who said the morning trade moved quickly with fishermen and hospital employees. No one recalled a man drip-drying near the heater or holding a map with ferry schedules. The sister called relatives in Washington and asked about any change of plans that might redirect the visit. None were reported, and bank activity remained consistent with a careful traveler who used small cash purchases along the route. A credit card charge at Juneau showed a ferry cafeteria meal during a scheduled break between legs. There were no Sitka charges and no attempts at withdrawals from machines that dripped onto the pavement near the lot. The pattern suggested momentum toward Sitka, then a full stop without financial movement afterward. Investigators checked hospitals and clinics for admissions matching Weaver's age and description during the week after arrival. No patient aligned with his file, and air ambulance logs listed unrelated cases tied to remote villages and fishing accidents. The harbormaster distributed a brief notice to smaller docks asking attendants to report unattended bags. A trooper walked through a gear shop and asked about any customer who seemed lost or wet beyond the usual rain. Staff could not connect the details to a specific person, and the inquiry ended without a lead. A month later, a hiker on a trail above the Indian River claimed to see a jacket sleeve tangled near a root. Officers climbed the slope and found a torn piece of nylon that had weathered through 2 storm cycles. Fabric comparators could not match the weave to Weaver's clothing because the suitcase sample lacked similar material. The location strained the timeline given the docking hour and the limited paths out of the terminal. The note entered the file under unverified observation and did not change the working summary. When analysts wrote their concluding memo, they listed elements that aligned with a simple failure to disembark through the usual doors. They paired those with elements that resisted such a reading, including the phone found later with no tower contact in Sitka. They added a paragraph on ferry architecture and how movement patterns complicate any reconstruction when cameras leave gaps between spaces. A final section summarized the sister's persistent calls and her quiet visits to the shoreline in the weeks following. The memo ended with language indicating records conflict and that the absence remains without a confirmed path. Years later, the terminal agent remembered the morning every time an unclaimed bag circled the belt after a rainy docking. The memory did not carry definitive images, only small impressions tied to radio clicks and the short flicker in the hall. State records continued to list Weaver as missing, with a note that he was last associated with a scheduled ferry arrival. The file stayed active in annual audits and drew brief attention whenever travelers asked about old cases related to the route. Nothing further emerged, and the routine at the dock moved on with gulls in diesel and rain. The stories. Why locals avoided that church basement after the flood. The church sat on a low rise beyond the river curve, and everyone still called it a safe hill. Neighbors said the floodwater reached the stained steps anyway, and the basement stayed damp long after the river fell. Clara Vass, 34, worked as a field insurance adjuster who took pictures, typed notes, and kept calm voices moving. She drove into the town after the levee break, aiming to document damage and close claims before tempers soured. Her goal for that day was simple: confirm a cluster of small claims tied to the hilltop church. The first change to her plan arrived when the custodian waved from the door, then refused the handshake. He gave his name as Ortis Malo, 57, a retired welder who mowed the lawn and watched the boiler. He said the sanctuary was fine, then pointed at the basement with a look people wear when a dog growls under a porch. Clara asked for access, and he said the pastor wanted meetings upstairs only. She took exterior photos, careful with angles, noting water lines marked by silt and by seeds caught on mortar. A neighbor named Nella Groft, 61, carried a crate of hymnals toward a sedan and paused to watch her. Nella said the basement had stayed locked since the flood week and that no one wanted to carry anything down there. Clara liked facts more than rumors, so she asked for invoices, damage logs, and utility records. Ortis handed over a folder with photocopied bills, each page smelling like bleach even through the plastic sleeve. The electric bill showed a high spike the week after the river fell, which struck her as odd for an empty space. When she asked for the basement key, Ortis rubbed his jaw and said the lock stuck, then said the pastor handled everything personally. She kept her voice soft, mentioned schedule pressure, then offered to meet the pastor after dinner and finish this site today. He agreed, but he kept glancing at the stairwell door like it might open on its own. Clara went to the county office and checked archived calls for emergency service, using an index the clerk let her see without fuss. The church address appeared twice during the flood days, once for a fuel smell, once for a welfare check that cleared in minutes. A dispatcher note said volunteers had stacked food in the basement for short-term storage. She returned before sunset, met the pastor near the front pews, and introduced herself with her license card. Pastor Enoch Varela, 46, wore a work shirt with rolled sleeves, and his palms looked scraped at the knuckles. He repeated that the sanctuary took no damage, then said the basement had a minor issue they were addressing privately. Clara explained her process, said transparency helped claims move faster, and asked for a basic walkthrough with photos. He agreed to a limited tour, then warned her that the air down there felt close and would not be pleasant. She took out a disposable respirator she kept for mold sites, and he nodded with relief, like that solved part of it. The key turned after a stubborn rattle, and the door opened with a smell like wet paper mixed with diesel. Steps went down into dimness that felt cooler than upstairs, and the walls showed a faint brown tide mark. Her light found a row of folding tables stacked with canned goods and boxes, all tied off with twine. Several tabletops were warped, and the legs stood at different heights because someone had shimmed them with hymnals wrapped in plastic. A generator sat to one side with a coiled cord, and the floor around it showed a clean square like a rug had been there. She photographed outlets, tagged the generator model, and asked why they needed so much power for a basement pantry. The pastor said the generator ran sump pumps for 2 nights, then stopped working from grit in the line. Ortis stood near the bottom step and rubbed the rail, his knuckles pale, like he hated the room and also belonged to it. Clara noticed a water line over the breaker box, which meant the panel had taken a hit and still looked strangely spotless. A woman appeared in the doorway, waved, and introduced herself as Paloma Cray, 32, a volunteer nurse with the food team. Paloma asked if Clara needed masking tape for labels, then added that people had slept here during the flood watch. The pastor cut in with a quick no, and Paloma closed her mouth and drifted back into shadow. Clara felt the hush that follows a correction and decided to run her questions in a sequence that built without heat. She asked about occupancy during the flood, and Pastor Varela said only supplies had been staged downstairs. She asked to see any damage to pew cushions or classrooms, and he steered her back toward the stairs with a brisk thank you. In the parking lot, a teenager skated past and kicked the curb, then said people said the basement hummed after midnight. He pointed at the brickwork view vents near the ground and said sound came out like a freezer that could talk. He grinned, then looked sorry for talking, and pushed off toward the next slot without another word. Clara sat in her car and recorded a memo into her phone, keeping the tone neutral and the timestamp obvious. She reviewed photos, zoomed on the clean square by the generator, and marked a note about missing equipment. That square looked like freezer footprint, and on a raised plan like this basement, a freezer could stay mostly dry. Her next stop was a building supply yard, where she asked the clerk for recent sales of heavy appliances paid in cash. The clerk shrugged, then said a man from the church bought a chest freezer late in the flood week and paid without a receipt. That detail qualified as a witness statement, and she typed it as such, careful not to lean on it more than it deserved. Evening pushed in, and she returned for one more look while people set up for a community meal upstairs. She asked Paloma for 5 minutes in the basement to recheck the panel labels, promising to stay out of the way. Paloma agreed, then quietly handed over a small key that looked too new for an old door, her eyes level and steady. Downstairs, the lights flickered, as if a loose connection lived somewhere behind the fresh panel cover. Near the far wall, she found 2 pallets draped with tarps that had been taped several times, and the tape pulled white in places. A faint, sweet odor rode the damp smell, like fruit left in a trunk after a warm day at the lake. She lifted a corner and found case water stacked over a long trough cut into the slab, its edges chipped and sharp. A length of garden hose ran from the trough to a sill drain where floodwater had once receded, and the hose still glistened. She followed the hose with her light, stepped around the tarps, and saw the end shoved behind a dented freezer. The cord was gone, but a film of oil on the floor traced a path toward the clean square near the generator. She crouched, counted to 5 to settle her breath, then stood and walked back toward the stairs to reset her approach. On the way up, she passed Ortis as he came down, his arms full of clean towels for reasons that felt unclear. Clara asked if they had documented any salvage from the basement that could justify the electric spike. He nodded too quickly, said there had been a spill from a donated machine, and that they had cleaned it thoroughly after. She thanked him, then stepped outside and listened to a rain gutter tick as the day cooled into night. Her hotel room was quiet, and she laid the photos on the table beside the binder she kept for flood jobs. She cross-checked the electric spike days against the generator ownership dates, using calls the county clerk let her copy. A pattern formed, modest and plain, which said power ran in the basement several nights after the river pulled back. She called a friend who worked restoration and asked about standard practice for wet freezers in basements. He said most techs would drag them outside, prop the lid, and tape a sign to keep people away until haul out. He said running a generator indoors for a freezer was dangerous, and added that diesel odor with sweet tang usually meant refrigerant leaked. Clara returned at first light and found Paloma sorting donated jackets on the front steps. Paloma watched the street, then said she had worked disaster shelters before and knew that water brings out the best and worst. She said she had asked to close the basement, and that she would be happier if an outsider made decisions for them. With Paloma present, Clara requested a formal walkthrough with full photo documentation, and the pastor agreed after a long pause. He suggested they invite a town officer to keep things calm, and she agreed without hesitation since an extra witness helps. Officer Renwall, 39, arrived and signed the site log that Clara carried in her bag for exactly this moment. They opened the basement door together, and the smell rose again, edged with sourness that set teeth on edge. Wren kept a straightforward tone, said they would check for safety risks and nothing more, and the pastor nodded with his jaw set. They moved toward the far pallets, and Paloma touched Clara's elbow, then pointed with 2 fingers at the sill drain. Clara photographed the hose, the trough, and the freezer compression dents that matched a recent move across gritty floor. Wren looked at the panel and said the cover was new, then asked if an electrician had cleared it, keeping his voice even. Ortis said he would get the paperwork tomorrow, and stared at the drain like he feared what might back up through it. The twist waited in a storage closet behind a rolling chalkboard where someone had stacked plastic tubs in a neat column. Wren asked permission, lifted the lid on the top tub, and found medical waste bags tied with careful knots. The labels showed a clinic in a nearby county, and date codes matched the flood week plus 3 days after. Paloma exhaled, then said the town clinic had shut power during the worst night and that someone offered temporary cold storage here. The pastor stared at the bags and rubbed his temple, then said yes, they had tried to help and keep things under control. Ortis said the freezer had failed, they had panicked, and they had moved what they could to ice chests upstairs. Clara kept her voice in the middle as she asked whether any records accompanied the delivery of those bags. The pastor produced a photocopy from his wallet that showed a shaky agreement to secure and return the materials promptly. Wren read it twice, nodded, and said they needed to report this and arrange a proper collection, and the pastor said he understood. The pieces now fit the noise locals heard at night, the generator, and the spike in the bill after the rain. Refrigeration had kept those bags stable for a short window, then failed when the sump pumps stole too much current. The sweet tang in the air had been refrigerant, and the last trace of spoiled ice from makeshift coolers. They documented the closet, sealed the tubs again, and carried them upstairs where the air felt simple and bright. Wren radioed the county, asked for a hazmat team and the clinic contact, and kept his words plain so no one panicked. Paloma called volunteers to move the meal upstairs, and they did it quietly, like they were shifting a sleeping child. Within an hour, a small truck arrived with 2 techs who spoke carefully and signed every line Clara handed over. They packed the tubs into rigid containers and handed the pastor a receipt that settled chain of custody without drama. The tech said this sort of mix-up happens in storms when freezers are scarce, and that it becomes a cautionary tale for years. After the truck left, Clara took final photos of the basement and noted the cracked trough that had worried her from the start. She recommended a full inspection for the panel and air testing before volunteers returned to work downstairs. The pastor agreed, his voice steady now, and Ortis finally sat on the steps and let his shoulders drop like a load had slid off. The town never made a scandal of it, since nothing criminal had been intended, and the fix was clean and quick. That said, people still avoided the basement for a while, since memory can stick to concrete and walls like damp. They spoke of the humming nights as a warning, and they stored donations upstairs where anyone could see them in daylight. Clara filed the report that afternoon and drove out past fields that glittered with wet leaves pushed against fences. She felt no thrill, only quiet relief that the pieces had held together and that nothing worse had formed in secret. Her notes added a simple line that generosity without planning can rot faster than anyone expects in warm water. Later, she learned the church held a small meeting and told their members the whole sequence with plain language. They apologized to the clinic and offered money for the generator fuel that had been wasted in the failed plan. People appreciated honesty, but the basement kept its reputation because reputations have long legs when the air has smelled wrong. By autumn, the concrete was scrubbed, fans had run for weeks, and the panel wore a new sticker from an electrician. Still, a few congregants preferred folding tables upstairs, and no one minded because sunlight makes simple promises. When it rained again, the pastor stacked extra caution tape by the stairwell and kept the door locked without debate. Neighbors now say they avoided that basement not because of ghosts or whispers, but because they knew the facts. They remembered that freezers hum for reasons, and that a locked room with a sweet tang is a message rather than a mystery. The town chose to listen, and the story settled where most real stories live, halfway between relief and regret. Clara closed the file and moved on to other roofs and other high-water marks, keeping her methods the same. She asked ordinary questions in steady sequence and waded through pauses that often carried more truth than quick words. The church needed time, the town needed air, and the basement needed light, and they all eventually got what they required. Years later, the flood was referenced as a hard season, not a nightmare, and the hill stayed a safe hill again. People mentioned the humming when they taught young volunteers how to store donations and why clear logs matter most. The pastor still kept the key, but he also kept the receipt that proved the chain unbroken, which made him sleep better. Clara would sometimes pass through on other assignments and find Paloma sorting jackets on the steps with calm hands. They would wave as if nothing remarkable had happened, which felt correct because the point was that nothing worse had arrived. The basement door stayed closed unless the work demanded it, and that quiet was the final lesson worth holding. The stories. What stayed behind in this motel room window? The room was standard. 2 beds, a humming wall unit, and a window that faced the parking lot where big rigs idled through the night. What didn't look standard, once the sun rose low and flat, was the faint writing that only appeared across the glass at a shallow angle backward, patchy, like a message scrubbed hard but not gone. Rhea Mallory, 37, an insurance field adjuster on a week of hail damage claims, noticed it as she packed. She had meant to drink the motel's thin coffee, make 2 calls, and hit the interstate before the heat came up. The plan wobbled when the gold light caught on the pane and stitched a sentence out of streaks. She leaned close. 3 words. Reversed, as if intended for someone outside. The first resolved quickest. He. The second took longer. Was. The third broke into stuttered islands before joining. Here. Rhea didn't trust hunches for work, but she did trust her eyes. The glass held something that wanted to stay. She touched the pane with her knuckle, careful not to smear. The letters were not marker or paint. They looked like oil lifts, the kind that come from fingers pressed to a clean surface, then wiped without full success. Years of photographing dent patterns and windshield webs had made her look for directionality, downstrokes, stopping points. The H's verticals were heavier at the top. Somebody had reached up to write it. The height matched a kid, maybe a small teenager, maybe someone standing on a heel. The backward presentation meant whoever wrote it had been inside the room, not out in the lot. Rhea stepped back, then forward again, catching the angle to reread. He was here. It wasn't much by itself. Still, it clicked against something she half remembered. A flyer she'd seen in a gas station along this same highway, western Nevada. A wide run of sage and salt flat about a kid who had vanished years ago, last seen near an old roadside motel. The details on the flyer had been faded and generalized, and she hated the feeling of turning strangers into puzzles. But the message on the glass wouldn't let go. She snapped a photo, then another with the curtain pulled halfway to throw side shadow. Insurance habit. She set her phone on the sill and made a line in her notebook, room 23, north building, roadside motel off the state route near the truck stop, morning light from the east. She added the date in her own style, early September of 2011, because she'd learned that memory softens the edges of time. Down at the front desk, a man with the posture of a coiled garden hose slid a receipt across the counter. He wore a shirt with a stitched name. Denton Kroll, property manager. He had the long stare of someone who had solved the same small problems for too many seasons. Rhea mentioned the window, casual like it was a maintenance note. Cleaning streaks, Kroll said. Windex when the sun hits. He tapped the desk with a capped pen. Happens. Could be, she said. It looks like words, though. Backward, like someone wrote from inside. People do all kinds of things to glass, he said, not looking up. Kids breathe and draw hearts. Guests leave handprints. Our crew wipes it down. Since when have you managed this place? Rhea asked. Still casual. Late 2000s, he said. Before that, it was old Mr. Levitt's. He let things slide. We've replaced a lot of panes, Truth told. He would not say more, and she didn't push. It wasn't her business. She was there for roof photos and the dent farm on a fleet of sedans. But curiosity has a way of hiring a seat beside duty. Back in the room, she stood the motel stationary on edge to catch more oblique light. The letters resolved again. She took a slow breath, then put her phone on voice memo not to narrate, just to capture the ambient hum and her measures. A trick a photographer had taught her to anchor memory later. The air smelled like old cleaner and the metal tang of the window track. Her internal clue came by accident. When she slid the curtain fully open, the bottom hem snagged on a plastic spacer in the aluminum frame. The spacer was cracked, held with a sliver of old tape. The tape wore a different sheen than the rest of the frame. Brittle amber with torn fibers pressed into it. On top of that tape, ground into the glue, lay a tiny fleck of blue wax, the kind cheap crayons leave. Someone had taped something in place, maybe a page, maybe a label long enough for wax to settle. It matched the backward writing. If a sign had ever been stuck there, it would read correctly to the room. She wrapped the little tape shard in the motel stationery. Not as evidence she wasn't law enforcement, but because it felt wrong to leave it to a vacuum head. She took macro shots of the frame, the spacer, the wax fleck, and the area of glass where the words showed best. Then she checked out, turned in her key card, and drove to the first claim 2 towns over. She told herself it would end there. It didn't. At lunch in a diner with counter stools and a corkboard of lost puppies and church suppers, she asked the waitress if the motel had any stories. The waitress, thin braid, name tag reading, Paloma rolled her eyes. Depends on your appetite, Paloma said. Folks, stop, sleep, leave. Years back, a trooper sat there with coffee for a week straight. Didn't say why, just watched the door. Remember when? Rhea asked. Late 90s? Maybe early 2000s? Paloma said. Time fuzzes. He had a name like Otero, or something like that. People said a kid was missing. No one talked specifics. Rhea looked at her phone photos again in the car. He was here. She tried to leave it alone. That night, at another motel 2 counties away, she gave in and called the number on a public information page she found for the State Highway Patrol. A desk officer forwarded her to a sergeant who handled cold inquiries. She left a measured voicemail, using evidence terms that felt correct to her station. I'm calling about a motel window in Western Nevada. Room 23, North Building. There's old oil-lifted writing that reads, he was here when viewed at an oblique angle. There's also tape residue with blue crayon wax embedded in a spacer on the frame. I'm not asserting anything, just saw it, photographed it, and thought it might matter if there were any archived calls tied to that property. A day later, a woman called back, voice steady, words spare. She introduced herself as Sergeant Mara Vickery. Rhea put her on speaker and laid out exactly what she'd seen in order. Vickery didn't indulge or discourage. She asked for the photos and the exact position of the room relative to the parking lot. She also asked about the condition of the glass scratches, chips, or a logo in the corner that would indicate the manufacturer and tempering date. Rhea checked. The corner carried a faint etched mark. She had to tilt it hard to read. She wrote it down. Vickery hummed. The way someone does when a thing aligns with a file in memory. Here's what we have, reportedly, Vickery said. In late spring of 1999, a teenage boy traveling with extended family was reported missing along that corridor. Last confirmed sighting was a convenience store, 2 exits from your motel. Dispatch logs note a search and a hotel canvas. Witness statements varied. No sign. The case is cold, not active. We do not discuss names. Her tone made a boundary plain without being harsh. I'm not asking for any names, Rhea said. I can send you everything. One more thing, there's a crack in the plastic spacer on the frame that's been taped over for a long time. The tape is ambered. There's blue crayon wax ground into it that felt like it was from inside, not outside. Copy that, Vickery said. Send what you have. Rhea sent the photos with a short note. She expected silence. Instead, Vickery called again the next afternoon. The mark you read on the glass etching is interesting, the sergeant said. It indicates the glass was manufactured in 2003. The motel you stayed in? Our old notes suggest it had original panes at the time of the search in 1999. So, if the panel in room 23 was replaced sometime after 2003, whatever writing you saw could predate that replacement only if transferred in some way. More likely, the writing was made after 2003, meaning the message came later than the disappearance, Rhea said. Most likely, Vickery said. This isn't a TV turn. It doesn't solve anything. But it revises assumptions about timeline and occupancy. It suggests someone connected, or someone who wanted us to think they were connected, came back to that room after 2003. We would need maintenance records to know exactly when the glass went in. It made sense, and it did not hand her any drama. It did offer direction. Rhea drove back after her last claim and asked for Kroll again. She didn't pretend she had authority. She did not hint at leverage. She simply showed the macro photo of the etching and the cracked spacer and asked if he had any records on window replacements. Kroll rubbed his jaw as if checking for new bones. We replaced a batch after a wind event, he said. Glass was whistling. I'll look. He returned with a gray file folder crusted with Post-its. Inside sat stapled invoices with dates in the margins. Early August of 2007, Units 12 through 24, North Building. Supplier, Lima's Glass Service. Installer initials? You mind if I photograph these? Rhea asked. Knock yourself out, Kroll said, and for the first time, he looked tired in a way that wasn't irritated, just human. The external confirmation came when Rhea called the number on one of the old invoices and got a man answering on the second ring. Limas, he said. Hector speaking. He remembered the job, long run of aluminum frames that had gone chalky from sun, Hector Limas said. We swapped panes and spacers where needed. I had to rig a few things because the sill channels were bent. We didn't touch curtains. New tempered glass, stamped 2003 because that's what the distributor had bulk. Do you remember room 23? Rhea asked, knowing the question was broad and that memory is a wide net. Vaguely, he said. I remember one where the inside of the glass looked fingerprinted even after cleaning. We assumed someone had handled the pane before it cured. The housekeeper complained the smears came back in certain light. We used ammonia. It didn't fully lift. That's not unusual. Oils can ghost. Did you ever see writing in the oil? She asked. Could've, he replied. I don't read windows for stories. We replaced what was cracked. You're talking ghosts. They happen. If you think it's more, tell the troopers. She had already done that. She thanked him and wrote his comments down exactly, adding reportedly and remembered vaguely, because precision and humility can keep a story honest. Over the next week, Rhea kept doing her real job, hail dents, roof lines, signature blocks, while she let the window gather its own weight. The sergeant called one more time to say they had pulled the motel's old work orders. The pane in room 23 had been replaced in early August of 2007, matching the invoice. Maintenance logs around that month showed a housekeeping note. Writing keeps showing on 23 window. Tried vinegar. Still shows in morning. That note was funneled through a retired dispatcher named Sella Winters, who had saved a cardboard banker's box of old shift printouts, the way certain people keep the world from slipping because they know it tries. A quiet logic emerged. The boy missing from 1999 and there was never a name spoken could not have written he was here on a piece of glass installed 8 years later, unless he returned. That didn't guarantee that he had. The message could have been a relational echo, a cousin, a friend, someone marking grief. But the tape shard and the wax fleck told another piece. The blue wax had come from a cheap crayon, likely pressed while paper was taped inside the frame. That suggested a small person sitting there, drawing, or someone steadied a page while trying to line up letters against the glass. The residue was on the inside spacer, not outside. That meant a moment happened in the room, not on the lot. Vickery asked a small favor that Rhea could do without crossing lines. Return to the room and try to lift a better photograph with crosslight. Rhea booked herself back into the motel on her own dime at the tail end of a loop. She requested 23 and got it after a shrug from Kroll. She came prepared with nothing fancy, just a black foam board to bounce light and a cheap angled flashlight from a hardware store. When the first edge of sun moved off the far hills, the letters bloomed again. She fixed the angle with books and the foam board, then took a series at different exposures. In 2 of them, a smudge sat low and right. Below the third word, barely a mark unless you expected it. It looked like a short curve with 2 dots and a drag. Rhea stared until she understood what shape it wanted to be. A crude smiley face, the kind drawn in 3 seconds by distracted hands. In the room notebook, decades old, Sella Winters had jotted a dispatch aside in 1999 that mentioned the kid's habit of drawing quick smiley faces in margins when nervous, according to a teacher's comment taken by phone. That was not proof. It was a soft echo between 2 separate things. Still, the echo categorized itself as relevant. When Rhea sent the new images, Vickery didn't tell her it solved anything. She said, this tightens the inference that whoever made the marks had knowledge of the kid's habits or was the kid. It also keeps the time frame post-2003. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A pane installed in early August of 2007 kept showing lifted writing when morning light hit right. Housekeeping noticed. The content read, he was here, and, in some readings, a simple face below. Tape residue and a crayon fleck lived on the interior spacer. Maintenance logs matched the install. A glazier remembered ghosted oils. Dispatch logs from 1999 contained an aside about a kid's doodles. None of that made a clean line to cause. It did what good detail does. It removed a few wrong lines. The twist, quiet but firm, landed 2 months later, not for Ria's benefit and not with fanfare. Vickery called to let her know that, in reviewing archived calls surrounding the motel, a short anonymous tip from late summer of 2007 had been found. The caller, whose voice was masked by the crush of a payphone, had said only, "Check the north building, second floor, room by the ice machine. Mornings show messages." The number had been a dead end then. The note sat in the file without connection because no one had compared it to the install logs. Now they matched. The pane had just been replaced. The message, then, could not be a relic from before the disappearance. It was a marker laid down later, possibly by someone who had returned to a familiar place to say something without saying much at all. Rhea asked the only question she could. "Does this help?" "It helps me not waste time on a wrong year," Vickery said. "Sometimes that's the whole gain." And that was it. No chase, no doors kicked. Instead, a timeline corrected by what stayed behind in a motel room window. Rhea didn't tell the story to anyone who would make it into a campfire shock. She kept the tape shard in a small envelope with the word motel and the date in her hand, even though she knew it had no chain of custody value. It wasn't evidence for court, it was gravity for memory. On her last pass through that stretch of highway before winter, she pulled into the truck stop at dusk and watched the north building of the motel throw its square lights into the lot. The window of room 23 held the look of any other. A woman in a denim jacket let down the blinds. A kid ran past, dragging a suitcase that clicked over seams. None of them knew what the glass had whispered. That felt right. A real story refuses to belong to whoever tells it the loudest. Rhea stood there until the sodium lamps came up and turned everything the same, tired amber. The hum of diesel engines filled the air, the kind of sound that flattens thought. She thought, briefly, of the words someone had pressed there with damp fingers and of the faint, silly face below. Not testimony, not confession, just a note at the exact height of a small person trying to leave proof of a breath. The truth in it was not the grand kind. It was the modest, late kind, the kind that lets people who do this work say, later, with care, that a thing likely happened in a different month than everyone thought, and that a pane of glass, replaced in early August of 2007, had kept those mornings honest for years. She drove away without looking back, because looking back is for when there's nothing left to file. The motel settled into the dark, the window settled into shadow, and whatever stayed behind stayed there, just oil, just light, just enough. The stories. This dispatcher flagged a warning nobody else heard. In the summer of 2015, a small county dispatch center in the Midwest logged what should have been another quiet night routine: calls, minor accidents, nothing serious. But at 2:36 a.m., dispatcher Lorna Keats flagged a single line in the call log with a red warning tag. The rest of the shift didn't notice. 12 hours later, a missing person report came in from the same road. Lorna was 52, a mother of 3, and one of the few veteran dispatchers still working nights. She'd spent more than 20 years listening to the county breathe through static. Drunk drivers, runaway teens, distant gunshots that usually turned out to be fireworks. That night, she was scheduled to train a new hire, Evan Rhodes, a quiet 20-something fresh out of community college. He remembered her as calm, methodical someone who double-checked even the quiet calls. The call in question lasted just 19 seconds. It came from an unregistered prepaid cell phone traced to the stretch of County Route 47 between mile markers 19 and 20. The caller didn't say much, just a breathy male voice repeating, "He's still here," before the line cut. Background noise? Steady hum, maybe an engine, maybe wind? Lorna replayed the audio 3 times, then filed it under possible domestic disturbance. But something made her stop the recording and reopen it. According to her later statement, she heard a faint ticking sound under the voice, mechanical, uneven. "Like a turn signal that never clicked off," she said. At 2:38, she added a note, "Warning possible vehicle hazard, County 47." No one responded. The patrol car assigned to that region had already been rerouted to a stranded motorist 15 miles away. The shift ended at 6, and by the next day, the flag was buried beneath dozens of other overnight notes. 2 days later, a farmer found a truck half submerged in a drainage ditch along the same stretch of road. Inside was 30-year-old Bradley Norham, a construction worker from a nearby town. Engine still idling, phone missing, seatbelt unlatched. Coroner placed the time of death around 2:40 that same morning, within minutes of Lorna's flagged call. County investigators wrote it up as a single-vehicle accident. They said Bradley likely swerved to avoid a deer, hit the embankment, and drowned before he could escape. Lorna, however, couldn't let it go. She'd handled too many wrecks to ignore the timing. The ticking sound, the phrase, "he's still here," the untraceable number, it didn't add up. A week later, she retrieved the audio from archive storage and took it home on a thumb drive. Her husband found her replaying it that evening, headphones pressed tight, not speaking for almost an hour. She said she thought she heard two different voices, one layered under the main one. A whisper, or maybe a radio echo, she told him. He dismissed it as interference, but Lorna wasn't satisfied. She called the phone company listed in the report, Westridge Cellular, to ask about prepaid tower logs. The representative told her the call had pinged off a repeater near Old Mill Road, 2 miles east of the crash. Problem was, that tower had been offline for maintenance between midnight and 3 a.m. She double-checked through county records. The outage was confirmed. If that was true, the call shouldn't have connected at all. When she brought this to her supervisor, he told her it wasn't her concern. "The system hiccups sometimes," he said. "Let it go." Instead, she filed a quiet memo through the internal server detailing her findings and sent a copy to a friend in the State Highway Patrol. The friend, Officer Miriam Cole, kept the note, but admitted later she didn't think much of it until months afterward. Then, in November of that year, a storm knocked out power across the same district. During the outage, technicians discovered a repeater box still running from an auxiliary generator, a model decommissioned years earlier. Inside it was a burned SIM card fused into the port. Serial number partially visible. It matched the first digits of the untraceable phone from Lorna's warning. This detail never made the official report. A small internal inquiry followed, but concluded there was no functional link between the repeater malfunction and any known incident. By that point, Lorna had already transferred to a day shift. She told coworkers she didn't want to hear the night anymore. Years later, a regional journalist researching abandoned communication systems stumbled on the archived memo. The journalist, Alan Marin, interviewed Lorna at her kitchen table in 2020. By then, she'd retired and moved to a smaller town near the river. In the recording, which he later shared for a local podcast, she said something quietly that caught his attention. "You know what gets me?" he said. "He's still here." Not, "I'm still here." Someone else was supposed to hear it. Alan followed the breadcrumb trail dispatch logs, weather reports, the crash file, and that malfunctioning repeater. He found that the generator inside had been serviced twice after its supposed decommission date, each time by a subcontractor called Northspan Utilities. Northspan had folded in 2013, 2 years before the incident. Whoever maintained that repeater after the shutdown wasn't listed in county records. Alan managed to contact one former Northspan technician, a man named Dennis Harlow. Dennis said that in the early 2000s, some repeaters were used to piggyback maintenance frequencies for nearby rail lines. It was a cheap way to test emergency signals, he said. But it was never supposed to overlap with civilian channels. If it did, you'd get bleed-through, like ghost calls. Ghost calls. That term caught traction online when Alan's podcast aired, though Lorna hated it. She said the word ghost turned it into superstition, not signal bleed, not malfunction. Still, she admitted the possibility haunted her. The crash site, the voice, the timestamp, they lined up too neatly. In 2021, the county repaved Route 47, covering the drainage ditch. The wreckage was long removed, but for maintenance training, new dispatchers were still shown the red-flagged log from that night as a case study in procedural diligence. The warning nobody else heard, became a quiet legend among the staff, half cautionary tale, half proof of how easily small details slip away. What remained were fragments. The 19-second clip archived under a generic file name, the memo Lorna wrote, the service invoices from Northspan, and the coroner's note listing water in the lungs. Each on its own could mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern too odd to ignore but too thin to prove. Lorna passed away in 2023. At her retirement gathering the year before, a few old colleagues brought up the story. She just smiled and said, "It was probably static." Then, according to Evan, her trainee from that night, she added quietly, "But static comes from somewhere." At this point, the facts that remained were simple. One call, one warning, one man dead on a dark county road. The system logged everything perfectly except for the truth behind that 19-second window. Whether it was interference, a misrouted test frequency, or something else, no one could ever show exactly who made that call or why it stopped where it did. Still, in the dispatch training manual filed a few years later, there's a footnote beside Lorna's case study. It reads, "Always listen twice before you clear a line." No capital letters, no bold text, just quiet advice embedded between procedural codes. A reminder that sometimes the sound we dismiss as noise might be the only signal that matters. The woman who disappeared near Carver's Gap. Travelers who stopped at the high pullouts near Carver's Gap reported a woman who waved once, then walked into thin spruce. The trail ran along the bald, where wind hit with steady force from the Tennessee side. Lights stayed flat and cold despite late afternoon, and the ridgeline carried radio traffic from both counties. No one noted a plate because the parking area mixed hikers and locals without clear lines. The first call reached dispatch just before sunset, according to logs released later. Her name in the county file from 2009 matched a teacher who had moved between Carter and Avery over several years. She was 38 and worked part-time as a substitute while picking up seasonal museum hours in Johnson City. Friends said she came for the rhododendron bloom and stayed for the quiet above the state line. She reportedly carried a cheap handheld map and a stainless bottle marked with blue tape. Investigators never confirmed whether she owned a reliable compass, despite several receipts found in storage. The last certain sighting placed her near the wooden post where the Appalachian Trail heads north across the grass. A retired lineman named Carl said she asked about a side path that cut toward Round Bald before the weather turned. He described a calm voice and a careful walker who checked the sky twice and tightened her jacket sleeves. His watch read 4:30 by his account, and his memory stayed fixed on the sound of traffic below. Some locals claimed Carl changed the time later, which state records do not fully address. Dispatch logs mark a second report from a couple who parked beside a dented sedan with faded county stickers. They watched a woman stand near the information board and fold a copy of a trail brochure into a narrow strip. The man recalled her glancing at a silver pickup with an aftermarket light bar, then stepping away without hesitation. The woman recalled a slight limp that appeared only on the downhill portion near the first switchback. Records conflict on whether those statements were taken the same night or days later. Rain moved across Roan High Knob after dark, and patrols split between the paved lot and the forest roads. A ranger from the North Carolina side coordinated with a deputy from the Tennessee side using a shared radio channel. Volunteer searchers gathered near Carver's Gap just after midnight and walked grid lines under steady drizzle and shallow fog. They found boot marks that matched her size near a side trail where moss hid pooled water. Investigators never confirmed those impressions because runoff smeared edges before a cast could cure. Archived notes mention a lightweight day pack found under low branches around a quarter-mile from the main path. Inside were snack wrappers and a folded paper with a grocery list and a museum shift date. A phone sat in the outer pocket with a drained battery and a hair elastic wrapped twice around it. The screen held shallow scratches but no cracks, and the case showed a faded tourist sticker. Technicians pulled the card and recovered brief texts that ended earlier than the last reported sighting. Avery County reports list two unconfirmed leads involving a silver pickup seen idling near the pullout before rain. One hiker said the truck crept past the lot twice, which he found strange given poor visibility and slick pavement. Another hiker said the driver leaned forward and checked the mirror often while the engine surged at irregular intervals. Investigators never confirmed whether the pickup belonged to a local contractor who worked on fences near the highway. Records conflict on the license digits and the description of a sticker behind the rear glass. State records show a previous call involving the same teacher on Roan Mountain during early spring of 2019. She reportedly got turned around in sudden fog near Grassy Ridge and waited beside a cairn until voices approached. The party who found her said she stayed calm and kept talking about frost hollows and bird calls to stay oriented. An incident note described firm boots and a careful pace with brakes at regular intervals despite dropping temperature. Investigators never confirmed whether that episode affected her later planning or gear choices before June. In the week after the disappearance, family and colleagues organized small teams and checked shelters to the north. A museum co-worker carried printouts and asked pieced questions at hostels and gas stations between Elizabethton and Banner Elk. Several people remembered her spending coins on coffee and a pastry at a market near Roan Mountain State Park. Others insisted they saw someone else with similar hair and a similar jacket, which complicated the running timeline. The county file from 2009 contains those notes without a firm ruling on identity. A storm knocked power lines across the ridge and slowed organized searching while crews worked along the highway shoulders. Helicopter support reportedly stood by until wind readings dropped into a safer band above the open balds. Heat signatures came and went as fog shifted across gullies and pooled in low draws between thick spruce. Teams marked possible tracks that crossed and recrossed animal prints near a wet seep where runoff gathered. Investigators never confirmed a single continuous line that matched her boots from the parking area. Weeks later, a trail runner found a stainless bottle wedged under a root beside a shallow step. Blue tape clung to the metal, and a fingerprint technician lifted partials that matched previous samples from her apartment. The cap showed light grit and a torn gasket, which might explain a sweet smell noted by two searchers. Some locals claim the bottle had not been there during early sweeps, which raised questions about movement after rain. Records conflict on when the site was first photographed and tagged for follow-up. The apartment in Johnson City held careful stacks of notebooks and a shoebox filled with admission stickers. One notebook mentioned a plan to walk the balds alone to map views for a lesson about settlement routes. Another page listed bus times and an alternate ride from a coworker whose statement later changed on 2 points. The coworker first said she offered a ride to the Gap, then said she offered a pickup from the Gap. Investigators never confirmed either offer, which left timing gaps across the late afternoon window. Bank records show a small withdrawal that morning and no further activity after the day of the hike. A library card saw used 2 days earlier for field guides that matched the notes found near the day pack. A phone account tied to a prepaid plan rolled over minutes on schedule without manual action from family. Technicians found no logins after the last tower handshake near the state line on the ridge. Dispatch logs carry that timestamp and mark it as the final verified ping. A rumor formed around an old farm road that drops toward a creek where anglers leave crushed cans. A property owner told deputies about a woman who waved once near a locked gate before stepping into Laurel. He could not fix the date and changed the season at least twice during follow-up interviews. His dog growled at the brush that evening, and he found cords of stacked wood disturbed along the fence. Investigators never confirmed the account, and state records caution that memory shifted after news coverage. Later that summer, a faded sedan matching the parking lot vehicle was towed from a private lot near Elk Park. A shop owner said the driver left it overnight and never returned to settle a quoted repair. The owner thought the driver was male based on height and a cap pulled low across the brow. The tag returned to a different county, and paperwork took time because of mismatched mailing records. Archive notes say the lead produced no direct link to the missing teacher despite initial excitement. By fall, snow brushed the high grass, and searchers changed tactics to check drainages for winter evidence. Teams followed game trails where leaves bridged small streams and gusts erased prints within minutes. A jacket scrap turned up near a low snag, but color comparisons did not match clothing in photographs. A volunteer insisted the fabric felt similar to a liner she wore during spring trips on the same ridge. Investigators never confirmed the match, and records conflict on whether the sample was cataloged correctly. The museum held a small gathering where colleagues read notes about her lectures on birds and trade routes across the mountains. A student recalled her steady pace during a field trip and a habit of counting steps between viewpoints. Another student remembered a hesitant smile that appeared when someone mentioned weather reports and trail etiquette near fragile plants. Some locals claimed she had hinted at moving away, which her sister denied in interviews with a regional reporter. The county file from 2009 keeps both statements without comment on reliability. Winter closed the high road at intervals and ice grew along shaded cuts where plows could not hold traction. Crews marked fallen limbs and flagged slick corners, while visitors stayed lower in the valley towns. The case slipped from headlines but stayed in quarterly summaries prepared for both county commissions. Detectives traded notes about similar disappearances along the border where ridges tangle and lines divide jurisdiction. Investigators never confirmed meaningful overlap beyond weather patterns and occasional vehicle descriptions. In spring, a new ranger reviewed the folder and walked the first 3 miles north at dawn. He carried the printed dispatch logs and paused where the bale wire fence dips near a wet meadow. He noted how sound traveled along the bald and how voices blended with trucks grinding up the grade. A sudden shift in cloud shadow hid the post where the trail turns and the path narrowed near wind-stunted trees. His memo suggested a simple misturn compounded by weather and fatigue without clear evidence of intent. Years have not settled the case, and no court file closes the matter with certainty. Reportedly, a hiker sometimes meets a man who still repeats the time and the steps and the exact wind. He stands by the wooden post and points where the grass folds over and the path looks wider than it is. Some locals claim she walked out on a different day and left by a service road near the towers. Investigators never confirmed that ending, and records conflict enough to keep the question alive near Carver's Gap. The vanished miner of Nome Ridge. In early summer of 2019, a seasonal miner booked a bunk in Nome and walked the ridgeline above town alone. He carried a used metal detector, a battered pack, and a claim map folded into quarters inside a plastic sleeve. Several weeks later, searchers traced his tracks to wined, scraped gravel and a shallow cut marked by recent shovel bites. Locals reportedly still point to that slope when the north breeze lines the tundra grass and the sea turns gray. His name was Daniel Kerr, 48, a heavy equipment operator from Fairbanks who prospected small leases during seasonal breaks and layoffs. Archived notes kept by a borough clerk say he told the front desk he wanted 3 quiet weeks near Anvil Creek. He paid cash for a room 2 blocks from Front Street and asked for a ground floor unit facing the alley. The clerk wrote that he spoke calmly, carried no visible weapon, and wore rubber boots with dried clay seams. State records show Kerr renewed a limited entry claim the previous winter and mailed 2 small payments from a post office kiosk. The county file from 2009 includes a faded survey of the same bench, annotated with pencil arrows around a shallow tributary bend. Some locals claimed an older prospector had washed flakes there after a flood rearranged bars along the creek mouth. Investigators never confirmed whether Kerr knew those stories, though a library sign-out shows he borrowed 2 regional mining guides. On a Tuesday, dispatch logs recorded a weather advisory for dense coastal cloud and intermittent drizzle, with ceiling low and visibility variable. A taxi receipt in his room lists a drop at the Dome Creek pullout just before noon, with gear loaded in careful stages. A store owner later told troopers he sold Kerr fuel mix, replacement hose, and a handheld radio that could scan aviation traffic. None of those items were recovered at the site where his footprints ended among scattered cobbles and straw-colored sedge. The first person to sound an alarm was Lena White, 36, a clerk who managed checkouts and kept the lodge keyboard. She reportedly noticed his key still hanging late Thursday, then again Friday morning, with bedsheets unwrinkled and towels folded inside the rack. Her archived notes mention two missed conversations about a package and a quiet guest who nodded often but avoided long exchanges. She called the non-emergency line and asked whether a welfare check made sense, then waited while staff inspected the empty room. Deputy Mark Oden, 41, flew in from Kotzebue to assist troopers with a grid search once a formal report was filed. He interviewed White, the taxi driver, and a maintenance worker who remembered helping Kerr carry a small pump to the curb. Oden later described the man as methodical and polite, with a list on notebook paper and a preference for working alone. He also noted conflicting accounts of departure time and load weight, details which investigators never reconciled despite repeated calls and follow-up visits. A team walked the ridge north of town and found shovel marks, a cleared path through dwarf willow, and boot prints with broad, shallow tread. The prints crossed a frost scar, skirted a hollow with pooled meltwater, and paused near a rust-stained boulder shaped like a wedge. A torn glove finger lay beside small pebbles sorted into a checkered sample tray, arranged as if awaiting a short return. Beyond that point, the ground turned hard, mixed with stones polished by freeze and thaw, and the pattern thinned into scuffs. Searchers followed a faint line downslope where wind had planed the surface smooth and left only darker grit between sparse lichens. A wide arc of boot marks then reappeared beside a patched tarp weighted with rocks, with cup rings and a foil packet lying nearby. Troopers collected the items and photographed a shallow trench with damp sides that suggested recent work before weather closed again. Investigators never confirmed whether the trench held any payable material, since it had partly slumped and pooled under the light rain. Reports from that week document 3 helicopter passes and 2 dog teams that worked in widening circles along gullies cut by melt streams. One handler mentioned scented trace near an abandoned culvert where snow lingered beneath brush despite warm air and steady coastal light. Another handler disagreed and wrote that the dogs were reacting to old human routes left by hikers and berry pickers in previous seasons. Records conflict over how long the team stayed in the highest zone, since fog reportedly rolled over the ridge each afternoon. Back in town, Oden checked cameras along Front Street and a service station where Kerr had bought coffee and fuel in a plastic can. Footage shows him scanning a folded map, speaking briefly with a fisherman, and noting something on a receipt before stepping into the parking lot. The fisherman later recalled a curious question about river levels and an interest in outflow timing when coastal winds pushed against freshwater. Investigators never confirmed whether that conversation influenced Kerr's route choice, though the creek mouth was not part of the official grid. A second search concentrated on drainage cuts south of the ridge where meltwater gathered in shallow slots that deepened toward muskeg and scattered pools. Volunteer notes describe thin ice inside shaded pockets, boot sinking to ankle depth, and a rhythmic clink from stones shifting underfoot. One volunteer reportedly found a strip of duct tape with a partial thumbprint that matched nothing in available files. Another found a snack wrapper that matched lodge vending stock, though state records say the batch code was common in several towns. As days passed, a working theory formed that Kerr may have backtracked unseen and taken a lower traverse when fog reduced visibility. That idea fit with the arc-shaped prints and the trench location, as if he wanted to reach his tarp without climbing again. It did not explain the missing pump, the radio, or the hose, which should have been bulky enough to impede movement. Investigators never confirmed whether a second cache existed farther down the slope, despite repeated sweeps and systematic probing of shallow depressions. A guide who knew the hill said a snow machine trail sometimes hardened into a deceptive ribbon that drew walkers toward an older cut. Some locals claimed that cut ended abruptly at a short headwall where loose gravel slid under light steps and carried people sideways. The guide's statement appears in archived notes, along with a sketch of the headwall and an arrow pointing toward a low bench. Records conflict on whether that bench was searched with poles or only scanned from above while fog drifted through the notch. Dispatch logs capture a week of calls from relatives and coworkers who described Kerr as steady, frugal, and rarely prone to risk. A union steward from Fairbanks said he never drank on shift and disliked crowds, preferring quiet cabins where he could read old manuals. A former foreman reportedly remembered a habit of marking bolts with lacquer to track vibration and a pocket notebook filled with measurements. None of those details offered a clear reason for a wrong step, a sudden detour, or a decision to leave equipment behind. During a final sweep, searchers found a shallow imprint shaped like a knee beside a tangle of willow pulled up by the roots. A few inches away, a smear of damp soil crossed a rock face and ended in grains pressed into a pattern like fabric. Photographs show no blood and no obvious shoe print, only disturbed grit and a thread that matched the torn glove finger. Investigators never confirmed whether the marks indicated a stumble, since wind picked up overnight and sanded the surface into a uniform crust. In late summer, the case file grew thin as weather improved and seasonal crews rotated home, leaving notes and maps in labeled folders. A short memorandum proposes that Kerr intended to sample at 3 points along a side channel where the creek bent around a low rise. Another memorandum argues he likely aimed for the mouth to watch conditions during a falling tide that could concentrate heavier grains near cobble bars. Records conflict on estimated timeframes since the taxi drop was imprecise and cloud patterns disrupted any meaningful shadow analysis. White kept a copy of the missing poster taped near the keyboard and wrote dates beside calls that asked the same questions. She reportedly told a visiting brother that the room stayed quiet for weeks, though the alley sometimes carried diesel scent after midnight. Her notebook ends with a line about returning a deposit and boxing 3 shirts for storage behind the desk with other unclaimed items. Investigators never confirmed whether a family member retrieved the box, since shipping records list only a surname and illegible initials. In autumn, a hunter spotted a rectangle of blue fabric near frost, stunted spruce, and radioed coordinates before weather closed again over the hills. A team hiked the bearing and found only a faded tarp shard, a snapped grommet, and marks from fox tracks in soft ground. The shard color matched nothing cataloged in evidence, and the grommet style differed from the tarp photographed at the trench site. State records list that lead as inconclusive and recommend renewed searches when spring snow recedes and the ground unlocks along the gullies. Years later, the ridge still draws walkers on long evenings when the light stretches and the sea reflects a dull metallic band. Some locals claimed the miner's cache lies near an old drift where meltwater vanishes into gravel and reappears below a low natural sill. Others point toward the head wall and say the bench gave way in thaw, swallowing a footprint and smoothing everything into wind-polished stone. Investigators never confirmed any of those theories, and the county file from 2009 remains a caution about incomplete ground. The story ends without resolution beyond the paper trail, a set of maps, and careful handwriting that measured days and minor purchases. Dispatch logs, state records, and archived notes describe a quiet man who planned small tasks and walked uphill before fog settled again. The ridge faces the sea and the town lights, and its gravel shifts each season when freeze and thaw pull stones apart. Kerr's name remains on a page that lodges between tabs, and the ridge keeps its distances when the wind crosses gently.